Any other
Yeah, I'll just
contributions?
um, I haven't got any of the old documents from Coventry and Warwickshire CDA, and unfortunately, they did what Leicester did, which is do away with the office. But also, they moved quite frequently, and I suspect that on each move would have thrown a lot of old documents away, which to a hoarder like me is quite painful. But there we go. Um, I don't think any of it, any of these archives went to the Co-op archive in Manchester, which is a great shame.
I couldn't
Um,
find any. Yeah.
no, it's more than a shame. It's a bit of a scandal. I mean, Andrew Bibby and I did a project on the history of worker co-ops, a funded project a few years ago, and we did our best to get archives and records deposited at the Co-op archive, but it was a really uphill task. They weren't desperately keen to have them, to be quite honest. And it was very hard to find stuff. So it's a real shame. The financial records at Coventry CDA are at Company's House. I've just had a look. You can download everything since 1995. So all this, or I've got the accounts for that year here on screen. Before that, you have to request them, and they charge you £3 per document, which is a bit of a rip-off. But I think they've probably got stuff going back to 1982, back to the beginning. So you'd get information about turnover and income. You won't get information about what was spent on staff and salaries and what was spent on rent and so on, because that's not in the accounts. And you don't get any information about what was achieved. So although we had to submit all sorts of data on numbers of clients, numbers of jobs created, that sort of thing, and of course we had to do that on a vast scale for all the ESF projects. But I don't know that any of that survives. I mean, maybe if you go to Brussels, perhaps it's somewhere in the commission, the bowels of the commission. I've no idea. But there is data there, but finding it and extracting it is a you have my sympathy, Francois, if you're trying to get that. Uh,
It would be DG 25, and there is SICUP, so it might be worth going there. They might have it.
well, yeah, maybe. I don't know.
So,
Of course, don't forget the early 80s was. I mean, we didn't have computers at all then. We got our first computers shortly after. We did have an electric typewriter, but that was as electronic as we got. So none of this was, and we got Amstrad computers and so on small disks holding 125K, I think, or 250K. So there's no electronic data from that early period, from the early 80s.
so yeah, I mean, you're reminding me that all of the European Social Fund programs had external monitors. I was the external monitor of the training programs in London under LCT from about 1985 to 89, when they then transferred to the contract was then given to ICOM. And again, I was the external monitor of ICOM's national program. And these go into the sort of, we'll have a lot of data on the sort of outcomes of those training programs. I mean, they continued over a period of about 7 or 8 years. Can I say, I mean, from memory, not a pretty story. I mean, there was a hell of a lot of self-employment generated from them, and that's about it. But it partly was to do with the vagaries of things, the various support schemes that were in place at times. So things like the what's the self-employment thing? Job something. I've forgotten the name of it now. There was a major
Enterprise allowance scheme.
pun.
Enterprise allowance scheme.
Yeah, that's the enterprise allowance scheme. Yeah, so that really mitigated. I mean, apart from the difficulties of creating a business from start without capital that employs 3 or more people, right? Put that aside, as a practical blockage. The incentive for a lot of people was to go into self-employment, and that's what a lot did. Yeah, so that using things like the enterprise allowance scheme, from which I mean, I mean, all of this sort of is what drove me to, away from the sort of organizational issues towards the financial and capital issues. I mean, that's, certainly by the the 1990s and into 2000s that became my focus, and it was a problem for. I mean, another aspect you could look at, I suppose, is about the capital markets for cooperative development, which remain very underdeveloped. I mean, it largely was tied up with ICOF, which lost its public funding in 1981. And it was therefore left to its own devices to try and work out schemes. The GLC put quite a lot of money in through the Greater London Enterprise Board, which is why it was successful there. There's quite big pots of money there that supported co-op development. But a lot depended on what resources were available.
There is at least one co-op that I helped set up in the early 80s, which is still going in Coventry, which is a theatre company. Still very, and they've got their incorporation certificate on their wall proudly with the word cooperative in it. So,
well, it seems like most CDAs at the time employed or somewhere between 2 and 4 people, right? So approximately, yeah. So, do you have any idea what your wage was as a cooperative development officer at the time in the 80s? I understand that with the inflation rate, it might differ a lot from one year to another and according to the areas. But what was like the average wage of a?
I can tell you we were paid on the local authority rates because it was set up by the West Midlands County Council, and our employment conditions were each year our salary was tied to is it called the NJC, National Joint Council Local Authority white collar. There was a blue collar and a white collar wage scale, wasn't there? We were tied to the wage scale. We pretended from that point of view that we were local authority workers. I don't know what the figures were, but there you go. Sorry, Jane.
I can remember that we were on SO1. That was the rate, NJC SO1, and it was about £9,100 in 1985. I think was the salary I was offered to go and work at Derbyshire CDA. I can remember that. And then in 1989, when I moved to Nottinghamshire, it was 14,000, and I can't remember after that. I don't know why those two figures stick in my head. But
yeah, I think Jane's right, because and I think when I started, because remember in the early 80s there was really throughout the 80s really a major inflation.
Yeah.
And I think I probably started. David might be able to remember this. I think I started on something like 7,500 or something like that, and then by the end of it was got to 9. SO1 certainly was the point it was on. Can I just say there was one other thing I wanted to just say to François about the benefits in terms of job creation. I mean, I agree with what everybody else said, that that a lot of the motivation was. I mean, people were doing all sorts of things. We had the steelworkers strike in '82 in Port Talbot. That was big. There was loads and loads of stuff. And then obviously subsequently the miners' strike. There was loads of stuff going on that was all about, resistance to the Thatcherite agenda. But there were other things going on as well. And for me, although you could talk about the benefits of the jobs that were created, and Happy Days had employed 25 in its heyday in the 80s and so on. Others were smaller, just half a dozen and so on. But for me, and perhaps that's just because I was, still very involved in the women's liberation movement then, really. For me, a key benefit to it was actually in South Wales. I think it played quite an important role for the women particularly for the women that were involved in it, in changing gender relations. And so some of the people that went on, and it was exactly the same after following the miners' strike with the support groups and so on there. A lot of women actually, even if they stopped being part of the co-op movement, the change in their role in the family and the change in their role in the community was just, and some of them went on to do amazing things, was really, really important. So I just thought I'd mention that, because it's very easy to just assume that the only benefit that anybody got from the cooperative movement has to relate to its economic measurement, and there were other social factors that I think were also important.
Yeah, and I've read about some of the all women workers co-ops in Wales, like Happy Hand Sewing co-ops and Ragged Robin, and
That's right. Yeah, and there were others. Crafty Stitches was another one in the Avon Valley, and yeah, yes, that's right. Oh well, you've done your homework. Well done, you,
Yeah.
François.
Yeah, and that was really important because it inspired other people as well. I took a group of women who call themselves Perfect Harmony down to one of the co-ops in South Wales, and that was really inspiring. I could see, there was a template there. They did it, we can do it, and they worked really, really hard and really, really well. And their co-op lasted, and it did have the same impact Jenny talked about. And then I did a taxi co-op as well. And that, again, it wasn't the sort of we want to change the world didn't really apply to them. What they wanted was to secure their jobs and were fed up of being ripped off by the person who owned the radio crystal, who could just, made them sort of use their own cars, but they got really rubbish hours and rubbish pay. And yet by doing it themselves, the more joined the co-op, it was a secondary co-op, the base cost came down for running that radio crystal in the office. And they got better rewarded. So there were financial benefits, and we sold it whichever way we could, really. It depended who you were talking to on what the benefits of the co-ops were. But the point is, and still is that we promoted co-ops when others didn't, and just don't see it as an opportunity in different ways.
Yeah, well, we had a number of smaller all-women co-ops. We also had black co-ops, and we had youth co-ops. And what Jenny said, I think, applies to them as well. But the point was earlier that I think Jim made really is that our agendas were not the same as our funders' agendas. So we're talking about our agendas, but for the funders couldn't care a toss about black groups, women's groups, youth groups. It was a sort of slightly Faustian deal we did with our funders.
Well, thank you very much. If there's no other answers to these questions, I will ask the next one. Then question 4: what about the inception of your local CDA? So I wanted us to look at who gave the first impetus to form the co-op. Was it like the city councils? Was there a trade union involvement in your development office work, or were they other established co-ops that helped create some CDAs, or was it just you and and your small hands working your way through all the paperwork and that stuff? So any memories about the inception of your CDAs, and who gave the push? And
I'm not sure there's a time for me to actually speak, François. There are different threads here, and I can confess I've never been employed by a cooperative development agency, and my perspective has been around community development and people being given agency and voice. And I think it's important to put this into some kind of historical context before we start dealing with lower level sort of issues in a way. As I think I indicated probably before we started recording, I've been doing an oral history project with Oxford Social Legal Centre and British Library, recording the work of 34 law centres over the last 50 years. And within that, the work that I did both at Adamsdown Community and Law Centre and with South Wales Anti-Poverty Action Centre all originates with well, if you look at it in terms of the national CDA, if we're looking at it historically, because I've actually done a bit of digging to support the work I did for the oral history project. Within the Labour Party, there was a notion of a national CDA being kicked around in the early 60s, and there was somebody called Terry, who was head of research department at Transport House, who was one of the main culprits.
Terry Pitt, I think.
Thank you, John. And I recall this being a regular feature in Cooperative Party literature. Now, this came to a head in the summer of 1976, when Jim Callaghan became Prime Minister in April of that year. And subsequently, and I think it was probably in June, at a Court Party 60th anniversary event, Jim made a commitment to establishing a national CDA. Now, Alan Williams was the Labour Corp South Swansea West Labour Corp MP at the time, and he was the DTI Minister of State responsible and was charged with taking this issue forward. Well, to his horror, he discovered that there were no working documents available to brief civil servants. What then happened was that a meeting was hurriedly called the Great and the Good of the cooperative movement, including Coops UK, Cooperative Wholesale Society, Cooperative Retail Society, and a bunch of other retail societies. And you won't be surprised to realise that there was no agreement on what should be done, how it should be done, how it would be constituted, whether or not a government intervention was desirable at all. Now, Hilda, my mother, at the time was very active on the Royal Arsenal Cooperative Society's political committee because of her activism in the Cooperative Women's Guild back in the early, in the late 50s, early 60s. And she attended this event and was had a ringside view of what was going on. And in her report to the political committee, she described the meeting as a mess and lacking direction. So following on from that Cooperative College Loughborough event in June of 76, my mother at the time was working on a regional economic development policy motion for the Labour Party conference of September of 1976. And in the process of her preparing for that motion, I sort of suggested that maybe we should be looking for regional CDAs rather than having like a top-down national approach to these issues. To my regret, I didn't mention the word local. And if you look at the motion, it does talk specifically in terms of regional CDA. So I confess guilt on that score. But at least we're actually trying to move a little bit nearer to the grassroots. Now, because of that, our shared interest in cooperative development, Hilda, my mother, mentioned to me in early 1976 that there was an EC anti-poverty program that was seeking funding, and their terms of reference were particularly interesting from the point of view of making mischief and cooperative development and giving agency and voice to dispossessed communities. So because we were aware of this program, an application was put together in June of 75. And what was very interesting, and Jenny will actually enjoy this, what was very interesting at the time is that, in all innocence, when I was working as the team leader at Adamstown Community and Law Centre, I approached the Council for Social Services in Wales and asked them if they were aware of it. And they told us this had nothing at all to do with us. They were bringing together large national organisations who were in conversation with Welsh Office about what should be done. Well, I don't know what they did by way of an application, but we put in an application involving 12 self-help groups in South Wales. And lo and behold, in after some delay, because Barbara Castle and Roy Jenkins were having quite a debate about whether we should be in or out of Europe, the Cabinet agreed at the very last moment that we should participate in this anti-poverty programme. And as a consequence, in October of 75, I had a letter from UK Home Office confirming that we had a grant of 70,000 sterling spread over 2 years, which is quite a large amount of money at that time. And that enabled us to employ 7 workers. And we were based in Merthyr Tydfil, rather than being located in Cardiff, which was already fairly well resourced. So that is, if you like, some context around how people, other people, if you like, became involved in cooperative development. It was through community development that some of us approached this issue. Now, one of the aims of South Wales Anti-Poverty Action Centre, or SWAPAC, was to advise, assist, support, and generally provide resources for existing and potential groups working on anti-poverty measures at a local level, including employment, housing, social services, and welfare rights. Another objective concerned giving attention to the implementation and detailed working of policy and optimum use of existing policy and resources. So you can see now the relevance of Urban Aid Programme, which Jim Callaghan introduced as Home Secretary back in 1969. And we know that, and this is a bit of a distractor, but Callaghan actually offered CDP funding to Cardiff Council or South Glamorgan County Council, and they turned him down. That resource ended up in Glencorrach, and nothing much really actually happened as a consequence of that. And I confirmed that by conversations I had with comrades living in that locality. So what we did was to actually break through into how we actually access or help groups access resources that they could actually use for their own purposes. Now, our terms of reference at SWAPAC were quite broad, and I don't think we really recognised either the scale of the problem that we'd set ourselves or anything else. Really, it really was a challenge. I don't know if I would have ventured it in my current state, but we certainly attempted it then. And our first contact in Merthyr Tydfil was with Dowless Knitwear Cooperative. And Jenny will be familiar with this story, I'm sure. Belitos had created large-scale redundancies. Women, in particular, were losing identity as well as employment and comradeship. And they decided to form what they called Dowless Knitwear Cooperative, which wasn't in Dowless, and it wasn't about knitwear, and it was barely a cooperative in a sense. But it was involved with cut, machine and trim operation and based in Kevin Coyd. And I remember going along to a factory on a small industrial estate just outside Merthyr Tydfil at Kevin Coyd to talk with a meeting with about 25, mainly women. In fact, they're all women apart from the manager, who you could guess was a man. And not a very good person at marketing either, which was his job. And what we did is we got involved in helping them with an urban aid application, with a job creation application with MSC money, and that tided them over for about 12 or 18 months. Now that was a very, very salutary experience, and it really focused our attention at SWAPAC around the importance of being very strategic and working at a secondary level, removed from groups. So what we then ventured with was a variety of projects, just to test, if you like, the the ways of looking at employment, unemployment from a community perspective. One of the first initiatives that I was involved in, was West Glamorgan Common Ownership Development Agency. And one of the best things that ever happened was appointing Jenny. And I hope she doesn't blush there, but she really was just the right person at the right time with a credit union, self-help, women's activist sort of background. And really, I mean, I think I remember Jenny's appointment. I remember certainly writing the urban aid application. But after that, I mean, we were quite happy to let people just get on with it, because that was the whole purpose of what we were trying to do. And then there were other agencies that were actually set up using IMP regulations. One was Rhondda Enterprises, just looking at opportunities for using the Youth Opportunities Programme in a community-based project that involved community, trade unions, politicians, and others. I was then involved in another project called Anti-Ativy, which Jenny mentioned earlier on. They still exist in a very different form than they were when I remember working with Michael Engelhard, who's now changed his name to Joseph, and Peter Henniker down in West Wales. Peter, that project was in a rural area and only succeeded, as did the North Wales Employment Resource and Advice Centre project, which was also urban programme funded across 2 county councils in North Wales, because in this instance, John Morris was the Secretary of State for Wales, and he actually lived in the Teifi Valley. So, and it was a very marginal constituency. So you can see how urban aid came to the aid of cooperative development in a rural area in a very sort of haphazard way, but demonstrated, if you like, the work that should have been done properly by the Development Board for Rural Wales, who really were not very happy about these local interlopers on their patch and wasting their time. Maybe Jenny might have to say more about that project earlier on. So there were other projects like Ferndale Home Improvement Service. That was, I'm told that I didn't realize it fully at the time, but that was a cooperative enterprise. It was a multi-stakeholder cooperative that we actually established with old age pensioners organisations, the Lodge from Ferndale and their treasurer, the National Union of Mine Workers, and other local people, including the manager, I regret to say, from Barclays Bank, all came together to organise Ferndale Home Improvement Service. The core funding of that social enterprise, which was democratically controlled by mainly pensioners who were on low incomes and female, and low pensions in that locality, with lots of disrepair issues. I mean, that came together really very well and survived until about 2018. So there's a marvellous programme there with a core funding from Urban Programme, plus, if you like, using MSC's job creation programme in an imaginative way. If I were to say that, I also recall doing an urban aid application, Jenny, for Port Talbot Cooperative Development Agency. And I can't remember the name of the young man that was involved there, but he was married to a person living in West Wales. Who was involved.
I can't remember either, but yes, you're quite right.
Yeah. And then I was involved with Cardiff and Vale Cooperative Development Agency, which was a local authority-led initiative with people like Jack Brooks and John Reynolds. My involvement there was when they were trying to sort out what sort of constitution they should have and how they should go about writing an urban aid application. And I remember meeting in the CRS building in Moorlands Road in Cardiff, talking with these people who previously wouldn't talk to us at all, because we were seen as like persona non grata, basically, and troublemakers. The other CDA I was involved with was the Common Ownership Development Agency in Gwen from 83 to 87. And that was urban programme funded. It was the least successful CDA, if I was to say that, in Wales. But you can see, if I can just stop at this moment, François and everyone, that we came at the cooperative movement through community development and giving people, communities, voice and agency. Now, that wasn't without difficulty, because the team we put together at SWAPAC around 1978 decided that I should no longer work on cooperative issues. Basically, we were hijacked by a neo-Marxist clique. And so the work that I actually did from mid-78, no, September 78 onwards, was theoretically in my own time. But basically, I got on with doing what needed to be done. And in that way, we formed conveniently, but necessarily, Anti-Growth Company, Welsh Community Enterprise, which Jenny will be able to tell you more about. But that was the way of actually linking projects on the ground, transferring knowledge, supporting each other, and sharing joys as well as other difficulties that were being experienced. Now, I'm going to stop there. I mean, I can talk about the National CDA in London. I can talk about the Wales Cooperative Centre, but maybe I'll stop talking at that point. Thank you.